So welcome everybody. This is our class on Chassidic Psychology. And every week, God willing, on Monday nights, for me, 10 p.m. here in Israel, and I assume it's something like 3 o'clock in the United States, we'll look at a psychological topic based on the Parsha. I'll try to connect it every time to the Parsha of the week. And hopefully it will work, and but no promises. It may not work every time. Okay, so today we're going to take a look at the Tabernacle, because that's the topic of our Parsha. Parsha's Truma is all about giving in order to build the Tabernacle. And the Tabernacle is quite complex. It has its courtyard. It has the building itself, the structure itself, and then all the vessels, they go on the inside. So on the inside, we find the Ark in the Holy of Holies, and then we have the table of showbread, the menorah, the candelabra, and the golden altar in the Holy, or the sanctuary. And then outside in the courtyard, we find the large altar on which all the sacrifices were brought. So what we're going to focus on today, is on the vessels inside the sanctuary. And when we read about these vessels, we find that 3 of them have a very interesting feature. Feature that's not found on anything else in the tabernacle. And so to see what this feature is, we're going to read a few verses. Let me put it on the screen here. Oh, this is not going to work this way. Share screen. Okay. Okay, so let's see this special feature. The special feature is described in a few different verses because each vessel in the tabernacle is described separately. 2 of them are described in our parsha, Truma, and 1 of them will be described in next week's parsha, Tetzaveh. So the 2 that are in our parsha are the Ark and the table of showbread. And there it says like this: regarding the Ark, God commanded, and thou shalt overlay it with pure gold. Within and without shalt thou overlay it, meaning it was it was covered with gold. And you shall make upon it a crown of gold round about, or surrounding it. The crown that he's talking about really is like a laurel. That's the description we usually have. It was like leafy laurel that was around the top of the Ark. We find the exact same language used in regard to the table of showbread. The table of showbread, it says about it, and you shall overlay it with pure gold, and make thereto a crown of gold round about. Again, a crown of gold, I guess, was made like leaves or something like that, like a laurel, circling the showbread, the table itself. The table itself is really just the bottom part, and then there were rods going up on which the showbread was placed above the table. Didn't actually sit on the table itself. But on the bottom part, where the flat surface of the table is, it wasn't actually flat, it was actually hollow. But in that area, around it, there was a laurel of gold. So that's the second laurel that we find in the vessels of the tabernacle. The third is, as we said, in the vessel that's described only in next week's parsha, and that's the golden altar. There was a golden altar inside the sanctuary, upon which the incense was burnt. and it was brought every morning, and the fragrance filled the sanctuary. And about the golden altar, it says, and thou shalt overlay it with pure gold, the top thereof and the sides thereof round about, and the horns thereof. So everything was covered in gold. The horns means that every altar has to have like 4 little cubes on the 4 edges, on the 4 corners. They're called horns. And thou shalt make thereto a crown of gold round about. So once again, the altar of gold, the altar of incense, also had a crown surrounding it. Okay, so these are 3 golden laurels that are the only ones that are found in the tabernacle. Now, there's a very interesting thing that whenever we think of a crown in psychology, in Jewish psychology, in Chassidic psychology, let me stop the screen sharing for a moment. Well, let me stop, or maybe it will. Okay, so whenever we think of a crown, so here we have to get a little bit into the mechanics of Kabbalistic thinking. That in general, the crown is a symbol for what is beyond, for what it is not possible to fully integrate into ourselves. So an example of the crown would be our faith. Faith is a power that is not fully integratable into our psyche. It always lies beyond us, beyond our conscious self. Now, one might think that that's not such a good thing, but right away, this becomes actually perhaps the most useful, the most powerful fact that faith is not fully integrated into the soul. Because imagine that somebody's psyche is broken. This happens to many people. It could be as a cause of some kind of psychosis. It could be a real pathology. It could be many different things that cause the psyche to break. The fact that faith is on the outside, it's not fully integrated into the psyche, means that it's always protected in a sense. It's always accessible, even if everything else is broken. It's a tremendous gift that we have, that God created us this way, that there are forces, powers of the psyche that don't lie inside. They lie in the crown. That's how we describe it in Kabbalistic language. So the crown is the force of the psyche, the force of the soul, the force of being a human that lies beyond our physical manifestation. It's beyond everything that we are. Like the crown that sits on top of the king's head. So the crown, in terms of the forces of the psyche, are these forces that are beyond. Another thing that lies in the crown are what we call our senses. So in our school for Jewish psychology, we have a long semester course on the different senses of the psyche. Senses would be like what in modern psychology are called intelligences, right? So we have an intelligence for music. We have logical mathematical intelligence. We have a linguistic intelligence. Some people have what we would call a somatic intelligence, meaning they have knowledge about their bodies. For instance, somebody who's a dancer is able to express themselves through their body. You might not think of this right away as related to somatic, but a survivalist in many ways would have somatic intelligence because they can get around a wild area, knowing where they are all the time, never losing their sense of where they are. People who practice martial arts have somatic intelligence. Professional athletes have somatic intelligence. That's a different type of intelligence. There's visual intelligence, which is something else. And then there's these very interesting types of intelligence, like interpersonal and intrapersonal. Interpersonal would be like the ability to be a good politician, somebody who can be a natural leader. And intrapersonal would be like a philosopher, somebody who has deep thoughts. So all these are different intelligences. In Kabbalah and in Chassidus, these intelligences are called senses, and they reside in the superconsciousness. They reside in the crown. They're above us. What does that mean for us? It means that we might have many intelligences that we're not even aware of. It takes time to integrate them into our consciousness. It takes time to integrate them into our lives. So somebody might not have ever learned music, but then the first time that they begin to play on something, suddenly this intelligence begins to pour out. And that's exactly the description that's given in Chassidus and in Kabbalah, that it's sort of like flowing down, it's coming down, like in a certain sense, like the flow of water flowing from a high place to a low place, but it comes down in droplets, drop by drop. It begins to accumulate inside the psyche. So there were many people who didn't even know that they had a certain intelligence, that they had a certain sense and prowess that they weren't aware of. But as they began to use it, they began to accumulate their knowledge of what they were capable of doing. So that's another area that is associated many times with the crown in Jewish psychology. A final area that is going to be relevant for us is recreation, the ability to have fun, the ability to enjoy ourselves, the ability to take pleasure in playing something, in some kind of game. This pleasure, this delight, is something that lies outside the consciousness. That's why it's so appealing, because in a certain sense, it allows us to lift ourselves and take ourselves out of our present circumstances, out of our present reality, and to enjoy something on the outside. That connection, that ability to go beyond ourselves, that's the source of recreation and delight in the psyche itself. So these were some examples of what we mean when we say that there is a crown. If there's any questions, we're going to have to save them till the end, because otherwise I won't be able to finish. There's quite an amount of things that I'd like to go over. So the fact that 3 of these vessels have a crown, have a laurel around them, would seem to indicate, it would seem to connect with this idea of something that's above, of something that is surrounding, something that's beyond. And not always does the crown have to be necessarily something completely outside of us. Sometimes it can be something that, as we'll see as we go on, is actually quite close to our experience. But you'll still see that even though it's close to our experience, and we seem to already include it there's another way of looking at it, which is that actually it's coming from the outside. So we'll get to this in a moment. So each one of these vessels has a crown. So if we understand what these vessels represent, we might be able to understand why they have a crown around them. Okay, so right away, whenever we talk about 3 crowns, 3 vessels with 3 crowns, then we're probably reminded of a very important Mishnah, a saying from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And we read this in the summer months when we read Pirkei Avos, the Ethics of the Fathers, as it's called. And there, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was the master of the entire esoteric tradition, the entire, what we call the inner teachings of the Torah, the mysteries of the Torah. He writes, he says in chapter 4, that there are 3 crowns. And what are these 3 crowns? He's not talking about the vessels. He's talking about something, you could say, more cultural. And he says there's the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of kingship. So the crown of Torah is something that apparently anybody could take, because Torah is open to everybody. If you want to place the crown of Torah on your head, and we'll see what that means in a moment, it's open for you. The crown of priesthood is a little bit more difficult. You have to have been born a priest. But there's a crown of priesthood. But this is, the whole saying is a little troubling if you treat it only as limited to a priest, and the crown of kingship as something limited to a king. Because if Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says this, it's probably relevant to each one of us. So then the question becomes, what are these crowns in daily life? What is the crown of Torah? That I can sort of understand. But what would it mean for me to assume the crown of priesthood? What was that? Well, what would it be to be like a priest? I'm not a Kohen. I'm not. So why does Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai have to tell me this? And certainly I'm not a king. So what do I have to gain from the crown of kingship? So the reason we're bringing this is because immediately this suggests that the three vessels that we talked about, the ark and the table of showbread and the altar, the golden altar, the altar of incense, and their three crowns correspond to these three crowns. So how would we draw the correspondence? It's not so hard to see. The crown of Torah is obviously the crown of the ark, right? Because the ark, what's inside the ark? The tablets of the covenant, and the Torah scroll that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote. So they have a laurel around them. That's what Rabbi Shimon calls the crown of Torah. We're building here a symbolic structure that in a moment we're going to apply to our psyche, to our psychology. But it's first important to understand the structure itself. So this is going to take a few more minutes. What about the crown of priesthood? The crown of priesthood is a little bit more difficult to see. How would we really relate it to one of these? Well, of these, the one that's really a vessel that demonstrates the power of the priesthood, and we'll talk about this in a moment about what were the priests responsible for, except for serving in the temple. They were responsible for a few other things. So the crown of priesthood is really the golden altar and the incense that's placed upon it and burnt, and the fragrance that comes out. Now, we're setting up the continuation already, so let's think a little bit about this fragrance. What was it about Aaron, the high priest, that was connected to fragrance, to good smell? Well, one of the things that comes to mind, and we're going to develop this some more as we go along, is that Aaron was a genius in human relationships. He was a genius in being able to mend relationships, to cause good, call it a good spirit between people. A good spirit is like the good fragrance. He came to one person, two people who had argued, and he came to one of them and he said, your friend, he's miserable at home, and he's only upset at the fact that why did he call you names he shouldn't have, and he's very sorry for it. And then he went to the other man and he also did the same thing. And then when there were a couple that were fighting between them, he did the same thing. He was able to find a way to make people connect with one another. Those connections are, as we'll see, like the connections that fragrance makes. It's the ability to what we call to smell good. It's like saying that a person, when you say that a person has a good smell in Kabbalah and Chassidut, what you're really saying is that his midos, his character traits, they're good. They shine out. They illuminate his surroundings. So in that sense, the crown of priesthood is like the crown, the laurel, the golden laurel around the golden altar on which the fragrance of the incest was burnt. Finally, we have the crown of kingship. How is that? Well, we only have the showbread, the table of showbread left, and its crown. So the crown of kingship must relate to that. The question is how? Well, the king, his purpose, the purpose of any government is to provide the basic means for the population to thrive. So that is like the table of showbread. Showbread, bread itself, has always been in every culture, in all areas of human life, it's always been a symbol for sustenance, for livelihood. And that's the role of kingship. That's the role of government. So far, so good. We have this nice correspondence. But what's troubling a little bit is that Rabbi Shimon doesn't stop there. He says this, first of all, there are 3 crowns, and he notes them. But then he says, he doesn't call it a 4th, but he says, but there's another crown. It's really the 4th crown. And what's the 4th crown? He says, and the crown of a good name rises above the others. There's a crown called the crown of good name. What is that? And where would we find it? In the tabernacle, because we've exhausted all the possibilities of vessels that have a laurel, a crown around them. So here is where we see the genius of quantitative analysis of the Torah. And this is the field of knowledge that Rabbi Ginzburg has certainly developed more than anyone that I know. And I don't think anybody in previous generations came to this level of development of the quantitative side of Torah. Let me share the screen again. So we're looking for a 4th crown. So here's the amazing thing. If we look at the first paragraph, the first 9 verses of our Parsha, Truma, where God instructs Moses to tell the people to bring donations for the tabernacle. So these 9 verses, they form a paragraph. In the Torah scroll, the meaning of being a paragraph is that you see that these 9 verses are a unit unto themselves. At the end of these 9 verses, there's a little gap. It's big enough that you can see it even when you look at the Torah scroll from afar. And so these 9 verses form what we call in Hebrew a parasha, or really, because not to confuse it with parsha, so people say today parshia, but it's a paragraph. So the first paragraph in our parsha, which is Exodus 25, verses 1 to 9, has, 9 verses, and it has 74 words and 295 letters. You have to like counting to do this. But as we'll see, love of Torah, the crown of Torah, is really the love of playing with the Torah. It's using the Torah as a source of delight. It's going beyond what my conscious experience has. So I can't consciously relate to 295 letters. That's too much for me to see. If I would look at the Torah scroll, I wouldn't be able to see that there are 295 letters here. You have to actually go and count them. So as you go through this process of counting, it's sort of like you're leaving your conscious self. The amazing thing is that 295 is the value of the 3 words, a crown of gold roundabout. Zer zahav saviv. So in the first paragraph of our parsha, we find the 4th laurel, the 4th crown that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is talking about. Where is this 4th crown? It has to do with the fact as we'll see that the tabernacle is a source of faith. It's much more than just the vessels in it. It's much more than the service that was conducted. In the end, the tabernacle gives you something much greater. And if we said before that faith is one of the powers of the soul that's always outside, when a person would go to the tabernacle and then later in Jerusalem to the temple, they would emerge charged with faith. The faith would flow through the connection with the temple. It would get much more than just that. But at the first thing to talk about that people received from making a pilgrimage to the temple was faith. And you need faith to live, because faith is not faith in God in the simple sense of, I believe that God created the world, or I believe that God gave the Torah. Those are important articles of faith, we can call them. But that's not the faith in the psyche. The faith in the psyche is what makes you live. What keeps you alive. It's what gives meaning to life. It's far beyond just whether I believe in this point or in that point. It's not dogma in the sense that it is in Christianity, for instance. Faith is the life force of the human being at all its levels. It's what we live on. Sometimes in Chassidus, it's called the pulse of life. It's what gives life itself its pulse. And so when you went to the temple and you came out charged with faith, you came out charged with purpose in life. You came out charged with meaning in life. It's like when a person is supercharged when they feel that they have a calling, that they have a purpose, that they have a mission in life. That's what faith gives. And I hope that we have occasion to talk about this in some other class about the vision of faith that every human being needs to have, a vision of what their purpose in life is. And that came directly from this laurel that is concealed, as it were, in the quantitative side of the Torah, these 295 letters, this laurel of faith, the highest one, which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai calls the crown of the good name. The Baal Shem Tov is called, if I would translate Baal Shem Tov into English, it would be the master of the good name. The good name is exactly this crown that Rabbi Shimon is talking about. The Baal Shem Tov was a genius in awakening people's faith, in awakening people's ability to feel that their lives have meaning and purpose, to believe that life is good, to believe that it's leading to a good place, and not to fall into the darkness of despair. That is the essence of what the Baal Shem Tov taught. And that was the essence of what I would call the churn of Chassidus. Chassidus churning Judaism from a religion that was, one can only call it paranoid, that was in a state of fear, in a state of reclusion, in a state of contraction, into a religion that was ready to spring out. And that's what the soul of the Messiah told him when he went up to the Garden of Eden, when he went up in his meditation to that high level. And he asked the Messiah, when are you coming? And the Messiah said to him, I will come when your well springs spread outwards. Which well springs? These same well springs of Torah that can churn you, and you have to love the name that Miller, I can't remember his first name, from Crown Heights, called his book Churning Judaism Outwards. That's exactly what the Baal Shem Tov did. he turned it into a religion of faith. Or as the Friediger, the previous Rebbe of Chabad, said, he put faith on a firm footing so that faith could charge everything that we do in life. Okay, so that's our fourth laurel. Interestingly, the number of words, 74 words in the first paragraph, in the first 9 verses, is the value of saviv, of surrounding, roundabout. The third word in this phrase, zer zahav saviv. Now, if we have any question about what this laurel is, what is it made out of? So you might know that the word zer here is laurel or crown, as we've been translating it also. Zer is equal to 207, which is also the value of light. So this crown is a crown of light. It's, in practice, it was probably made, like I said, like some kind of ornament that was all around the ark and all around the golden altar and all around the table of showbread, but it symbolizes God's surrounding light. We're not going to get into what God's surrounding light is in this case. Hopefully, this will come out as an article. This is all based on Rabbi Ginzburg's teachings, of course. So it will come out as an article in this week's newsletter. So if you're not signed up for the newsletter, please go to inner.org and sign up, and you'll also get this class as an article that you can share with other people, and you can probably review it much more easily and more clearly, hopefully, when it's written down. Another thing I want to mention before we continue is that tomorrow night we're starting our campaign for Rabbi Ginzburg and for Gali. And I mentioned this last week, and I'll mention it again, that this campaign is purely for our English publications. And the thing we're really aiming for this time is for a full repository of all of Rabbi Ginzburg's teachings, online, freely, for everybody. All the audio recordings that we have, all the video recordings, all the publications, all the books will be available online in text. And perhaps this is the most important part, that it'll be subject indexed, meaning that you'll be able to search by subject. And to participate in this really important project, I'm going to send a link in a couple of moments. Another thing that, I'm going to send it in the chat. Another thing that we'd very much like to do is we'd like to expand this program. Where I'm teaching right now, the Galinai Nishmata Beit Midrash or Academy, online academy. We have a lot more teachers that can teach. Our real limit right now is handling the room. I don't know if you've noticed, but I keep losing my train of thought for a second because somebody wants to enter the room. So we don't have somebody to take care of that because there's only one person who does this all day long, and he also needs to live a life once in a while, because we also have an academy in Hebrew, which works 6 days a week, almost all hours of the day. And then all the classes need to be recorded and turned into videos that are put up on YouTube. So there's a lot of work that goes into this, and we need funding to expand the program. So there was not, somebody asked if there was a physical fourth crown, and no, the idea is, again, that faith is not physical. It's something that's entirely beyond the psyche. Okay. So before we continue, I'm going to put the link up. For everybody to be able to take advantage of this opportunity. Again, I think that this is one of the most important fundraising campaigns we've ever had. And the link is now on the chat. Well, I went only to Toby. Let me send it to everybody. I guess that was a shgacha, Toby, that I think I already gave. I'm not sure. In any case, let's continue. So now that we have these four laurels and these 3 vessels. So basically we have really 3 vessels, 4 laurels. We have 7 levels here. And we've ordered them as livelihood. That's the table of showbread. Then relationships, that would be the golden altar. And above that, what we would call the Torah, the ark, representing purpose. So the moment that you hear this analogy, I think that the first thing that comes to mind for anybody who works in psychology is what we call Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay? I think it's pretty famous by now. Most people have heard about it, but if you haven't, so let's take a look at what this looks like. What was this hierarchy of needs? So I'll share am I sharing? I'm still sharing. I guess everybody can see this, right? Okay, here's his hierarchy. On the bottom, he has physiological needs: air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction. The way this is said very quickly in Chassidus, in Hebrew, it's mazon levush bait, or food, clothing, and shelter. Those are really the basic physiological needs that every person has. Now, interestingly, he just puts safety needs right above that. He says personal security, employment, resources, health, property. These are obviously spiritual. They're not physical, meaning they give you security. These are like the security blanket above your physiological needs. They're very much related, because one could easily say, that the physiological needs are the physical part. What he calls here is safety or security needs. They're like the envelope that protects your physical being. So you have personal security. That's like your personhood, that you won't be attacked by somebody on the street. So that's not exactly, it's a need, but you don't walk around with your personal security, unless you're a celebrity and you have some guy who's protecting you. But normally, you don't walk around with this. It's something that's sort of like around you. We're beginning to see the picture of a laurel, of a crown around you. What else is in the second level? We say it's like employment. Again, employment is not something you put into a box. It's not something physical. It's not like air, water, food, shelters, and so on. Employment allows you to keep and retain for a long duration your supply of air, food, water, shelter, so on. Same thing is with your right to property, the fact that you have property. It's the same thing. These, you could even call these as what every normal state or sovereign is responsible for giving its citizens and subjects: personal security, employment, resources, health, and property. Now, we can debate from now until the end of time, what is better? Is it better to offer X amount of security or no, or a little amount of security? But everybody agrees that some security you need to have. So that's the second level. The third level is basically what we call relationships. So he calls them here friendship, intimacy, family, sense of connection. But in one word, you would say relationships. The human spirit, not our physical bodies anymore, not our physical being, but rather what we would call our mind, our spirit, needs relationships in order to thrive. And those relationships, at their core, they are the family, the nuclear family, and then they expand beyond into the different relationships that we have with people. Above that, he places psychological, there's only one way to say it, it's called like psychological needs. It's interesting that he doesn't, maybe in his books he developed this further, but when you read this list: esteem, respect, self-esteem, status, recognition, strength, freedom, These are to relationships as security was to the physical being. In other words, respect, self-esteem, status, recognition, strength, and freedom. These are the psychological needs that we have that allow us to form healthy relationships. These are like, again, the surrounding light around the relationships. They are the psychological forces, powers, faculties that we have in us that allow us to build healthy relationships. A person who doesn't have self-esteem cannot build a healthy relationship with other people because he always feels that he's being attacked. He always feels that he's on the bottom. He doesn't respect himself. He can't respect others. The same thing is true of recognition. We all need recognition. So one company like Facebook has figured out how to make that into what drives the whole platform, likes. You need recognition. You become a junkie for it even. I don't know if that makes for good relationships or not. But you need recognition in the sense that within your family, a person who doesn't have somebody who's contributing, for instance, if a woman is cooking every day and there's no recognition for what she's doing, the crown is missing. The surrounding light that allows the love in the relationship to thrive is missing. So the truth is that if the family members don't thank her for what she does, not once or twice or 3 times a day, it could be 10 times a day, 100 times a day, then something's lacking in allowing the relationship to thrive. So these that he here puts in green, or they put in green, and he calls esteem, these are really the psychological crown around the psychological needs of the person, which are his relationships. They're the psychological faculties that allow relationships to thrive. Finally, here's where it breaks down a little for some reason. And again, it breaks down because I have to stress this. Without Chassidus, without the inner teachings of the Torah, without Kabbalah, it's hard for people to recognize the crown of this 5th level. This 5th level looks like the top when you don't have the benefit of learning from Torah. So the top here is self-actualization, or what we called self-fulfillment. He said, I have a purpose. But he doesn't talk here about purpose. That's not, because he doesn't separate them. He just says, if you are successful, if you've fulfilled yourself, that's the 5th level. But just as with physical needs, physiological needs, the 1st level, and the 3rd level, which is the relationship needs, the 5th level also has a crown, and that's missing from Maslow's hierarchy. And we just learned that there's a crown to each one of these levels. So what would be the crown of self-actualization or self-fulfillment? These would be the powers that allow that to happen. And it's very interesting. What is it that allows a person to fulfill themselves? What kind of faculties do you need to fulfill yourself? So we mentioned them in the beginning of the class. The most surprising one is recreation. You need to have a feeling, a spirit of being at play. As somebody, I guess, some time ago that I heard, somebody said, you have to enjoy the show. You have to be able to enjoy yourself. And you can only enjoy yourself if you feel that everything is really in God's hands. You can only take that step outside of yourself to see yourself from the outside and to take joy in what's happening, to take delight in it. If you can feel unadulterated recreation, unadulterated pleasure that is not linked to a physical need or even to a psychological need. This is what we call in Chassidus ta'anug bilti murkav, or pleasure that is not engarbed in something. It's just pure pleasure. Where do you get this pure pleasure? You get it from Torah. Torah is the source of all delights. King David says, if it were not your Torah, my delight, I don't remember the verse by heart in English. In English it is, let me see. If your Torah were not my delight, I would have perished in my affliction. Buddha tried to end his affliction by going out and entering the nothingness. And so the Eastern notion of meditation is to fill your mind with nothingness. The Jewish notion of meditation is to fill your mind with Torah. Torah is the source of all delight. The play that we did on just counting 295 letters and 74 words and 9 verses, that's one form of it. But there's many, many other forms. Torah is the ultimate source of exiting yourself in order to enter into the infinite. But the infinite is not empty. It's full of an experience of the Torah. That's what the Torah really represents. So let's now look at our updated hierarchy of needs. So the table of showbread and the table's laurel are the physical, the body, the physiological needs. Kingdom, as we said, is the bread, clothing, and shelter. And the emotions here, the table's laurel, they, especially what we call the emotions associated with the 2 sfirot. If you understand the sfirot, so we're here now in the 6 emotive sfirot. So especially among the 6, there are what we call the victory and the acknowledgement, which are what we call active and passive confidence, trust, that I have trust in my existence. I have trust in who I am. I have trust in my belongings. I have trust in my ability to be who I am. Those are needed for the security that Maslow here called the safety and security and so on, property, and all these rights that the king or the sovereign or the state is supposed to afford us. This is all represented by the table and the table's laurel. The next level is the mind, the psychological needs. In practice, that's the golden altar, and connections. In the Sfirot, the sphere that's related to the golden altar, to what we're talking about here, is understanding. Understanding is about forming connections. It can be connections in the mind, but it can also be connections between people. For me to enjoy the company of another person, I have to understand it. I have to come from a place of understanding. I have to come from a place. I saw one of my friends write today on Facebook something very nice. He said, whenever I come into a connection, into a relationship with somebody else from the point of view of what wisdom do I have to receive from this person, that opens me up completely, not to be judgmental, to be able to receive. Those connections, that's what understanding does. It's called connecting or comparing like with like. The damot milta lemilta, it's called in Hebrew, actually in Aramaic. Those are the connections. That's the fragrance that comes out of the golden altar. The fragrance is what we feel about one another. When there's a person who makes us feel good, the fragrance is good. When there's a person who makes us feel not so good, the fragrance is bad. The altar's laurel are the psychological faculties that make connections, relationships healthy and possible. So he wrote esteem and status, respect, self-respect, self-esteem. The most important one that Torah talks about, that he didn't mention, is what we call selflessness. That's the inner experience of wisdom. Here on the altar's laurel, we're at the level of wisdom. Wisdom is the power of self-nullification or selflessness. The more a person cultivates their selflessness, their ability to see themselves not as the center of the world, but rather that God is the center of the world and everything is revolving around him, not around me. That's selflessness. I think we talked about this last week. This will be a common theme because I talk about this a lot. That moment of getting on the merry-go-round and losing your sense of being the center of things, that's selflessness. And if you can approach relationships out of that space, you build good relationships. So that's the altar's laurel, the crown around the good fragrance. And then we have the ark. On the one hand, the ark contains the Torah. The Torah, the way we understand it, the way it's usually understood, until you learn the inner teachings of the Torah, is that it's a rule book. It's the law. It tells you what to do. It's supposed to tell you what you want. It gives you will. But that's only the external aspect. The Torah also has the ark's laurel. And the laurel is the delight in the Torah. It's the joy that a person receives from going deeply into Torah, not just learning it as a rule book. That's also true. That's the external aspect. And same in life. Motivation and will are very important. If you don't have motivation and will, you can never fulfill yourself. What Maslow called self-actualization. You can never fulfill yourself. You can never feel that you've done what you came here to do. You have to have will and motivation. You have to have a rule book. You have to have a schedule every day. But the crown on that schedule, that the crown on those achievements that you want to do, that you want to attain, is pleasure. What kind of pleasure? The pleasure that is like the delight of the Torah. It's a completely abstract pleasure. It's not pleasure from food. It's not pleasure from relationships. It's not even pleasure, psychological pleasure. What it really is what we call the delight, litaneg Hashem, to take delight in God, to take delight in pursuing God through the Torah, of meeting God every time that I learn. Like we said, there's a seventh level, the crown of good name. And the crown of good name is the faith that is above all of it. Those were the 295 words that we said, that we said represent the fourth laurel. The laurel, the crown that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai calls the crown of good name. And as we explained earlier, that is the life force of all of life. That's the pulse of life. Faith not as faith in certain declarations, in certain articles, in certain dogmas. That's not what faith is really about. Faith is what gives life. Faith is what makes life possible. It's the point of connection between the finite and the infinite. It's very interesting that I think the person who came closest to understanding this as a psychologist was William James. And he described faith as a leap. He always said that the leap here was from something that you could grasp to something that you couldn't. And he explained very correctly that for you to be able to move in life, for us to be able to live in the first place, we have to make a leap of faith. Faith is always going beyond what I know, beyond what I understand, beyond what I can perceive, And that is the link to God's infinity, where God is imperceptible, cannot be understood fully, cannot be fathomed, and yet there's a relationship. That relationship flows through faith. And that's the crown of good name. That's the building of the tabernacle itself, the giving itself. The giving itself is the source of faith. So it happens also to tie in with what I now need to say again, remind you again, that giving to Rabbi Ginzburg's work and helping us do more is a way to tie into faith. That's exactly the idea. And Rabbi Ginzburg in many ways represents for many people this tie to a higher realm. Here's a person, a very holy individual, whose life was dedicated and still is to connecting us all to the infinite in ways that are truly astounding. And again, this is all based on something that came out a few years ago, and it hopefully will come out. It will, God willing, come out after when the newsletter comes out on Thursday night. So please sign up for the newsletter. And the charity link, the campaign for fundraising, the link is on the chat if you haven't seen it yet. If there's any questions, I think I have the power to allow you to open your, I'm not sure. Let me see here. Yeah, okay. So if there's any questions, anybody can unmute their microphone and ask, or we can just say good afternoon or good night, whatever the case might be. So another thing that we could do is, I'm not going to put you on the spot today, but we'd really like to form a little bit more feeling of a community. So since we're going to be spending some time, hopefully more time together, and I want to encourage people to open their cameras, so you don't have to. I understand that that's one of the best parts about the Brady Bunch here, that we don't have to show ourselves. You don't have to, I'm just saying, but maybe next time we'll go through a number of people, just say where you're from, just prepare maybe something that you want to tell us about yourself. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot now. If you do feel that, open and willing to share, so